Hello everyone, and welcome back to our second session of this morning's webinar, and apologies again for running a little bit late and cutting your break time to 10 minutes. So now this session we're going to be focused on zooming kind of more out into the broader landscape and discussing questions around the shaping of today's thinking in the area of health research ethics. So to get us started, I'm really delighted to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Professor David Archard, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Queen's University Belfast and Chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. David is an applied moral philosopher who has published widely on many topics, especially the moral and political status of children, the family, and sexual ethics. He has played a prominent role in public policy throughout his work as a member and deputy chair of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, and now is the chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. So to facilitate the flow of session 2, we'll do our best to incorporate questions for David into the panel discussion. He's kindly offered to provide an email address for attendees to contact him in case we don't have time to address all questions. David, you might be inundated after this discussion. So sincere welcome to you, and thank you for being with us, and the floor is all yours.
Thanks very much indeed, Emily. My apologies to everyone that I'm unable to share my screen, so the wonderful AV technician Tomas is going to do that for me. So if you hear me peremptorily say next every so often, because he's moving things along. I'm delighted and honoured indeed to be the keynote speaker here. And I want to give my thanks to the National Office, Emily and others, for inviting me, and also for their excellent and efficient organization of the webinar and for preparing me. And I'd like to thank all of you for attending in such large numbers, which it seems to me is ample testimony of the interest there obviously is in research ethics in Ireland. I wear, as will become apparent, several hats, but I'm going to be speaking predominantly as the chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. I've chaired now for 5 years and will chair for another year. And I'm going to be trying to use some of the resources of the council that are relevant here. I think what may have been circulated, I'm not sure, but if not, you can find it on the Nuffield website, is a wonderfully prepared horizon scanning infographic. And that gives you a real sense of the range of topics that are on our horizon, not all of which we can possibly address. But if you go to that infographic prepared by my colleague, Catherine Johnson, and you click on any particular topic, you'll then find a brief description of it and whether or not we've done work on it. So I would encourage you to do that. And because the range of issues are so wide, I thought rather than do a kind of incredibly fast gallop through all the topics, I would try and identify some emergent themes, and where appropriate, use examples from our work or other work I've done that might help to illustrate those themes. And as has been suggested right on the last slide, my email, my university email, will be flashed up for no more than 2 seconds. So that if you want to take a note of it and get in touch with me, I'll try, and have any questions, I'll try and answer them. Okay, next. And again. Okay, so the Nuffield Council was created over 30 years ago in 1991. Next. And it's an independent body. It's crucial to stress that it's not a government body, and it's not even what is sometimes called an arm's length body. It's funded currently by the Nuffield Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, and the Medical Research Council. Next. And this is our short description of what we do. We identify, analyze, and advise on ethical issues in science and health so that decisions in these areas benefit people and society. That's our tagline. And believe me, that took an awful lot of work to get that single sentence agreed amongst us. Next. The council has 3 elements of the organization. It has a council of, including myself as chair, 16 appointed members, and they're drawn from various academic disciplines such as philosophy, law, social sciences. From outside academia, we have people drawn from genetics, psychiatry, pharmacy, public health, public engagement, law, and medicine. And in the past, our members have included a filmmaker and a prominent BBC presenter. And we act as the principal deliberative body of the organization. Next. Then there is an executive of around a dozen who serve to advise the council and help us to implement our strategy and program of work. And they assist us fabulously in the preparation of the various outputs that come out. And lastly, there is currently a governing body that has oversight of the whole organization and holds us to our remit and examines our administration and our business plan. Next. And again. So we have identified in a strategy that has now taken something like a year and is preparatory to us bidding for renewed funding over the next 5 years. We have identified a number of areas in which we hope to do better what it is that we believe we've done uniquely over the last 30 years. So firstly, we're going to shift our focus to issues at the intersection of scientific innovation and societal challenge. Next. And we're going to expand our horizon scanning so that we're in a better place to identify and anticipate ethical challenges and dilemmas before they arise. Next. And we hope to enhance our reputation as a trustworthy source of ethical analysis by increasing our range of high-quality outputs with evidence, expertise, and engagement at their center. Next. We're going to increase our focus on what we have liked to call embedding ethics in policymaking, and I'll give in due course an example of that. Next. And we're going to try and cultivate the bioethics networks that exist within the UK so that we can strengthen the voice of ethics in science and health policy, both in the United Kingdom and internationally, where we have widespread connections across Europe and beyond. Next. And we have identified some focused priority areas to guide our work so that we can concentrate on the most urgent challenges facing society. And let me be clear, these focused priority areas, which I'll introduce you to, are not to the exclusion of work we might do ongoing on anything as it emerges. Next slide, please. And again. So we've identified 3 priority areas. The first is reproduction, parenthood, and families. And here we've seen extraordinary innovations in human reproduction, which challenge our normal traditional understandings of reproduction, reproductive options and choice. And these include developments that enhance or work alongside existing assisted reproduction technologies and provide new opportunities for people unable to otherwise conceive or carry biologically related children. And we're going to examine the regulatory framework surrounding them, as well as broader questions about the nature of gender, family, and parenthood. Next, please. And the next priority area has to do with the mind and brain. Again, extraordinary innovations in technology which alter our minds and brains, and new approaches to neurological research, care, and treatment. And these could fundamentally alter our abilities, cognitive, physical, and moral. And those changes bring a whole suite of profound ethical challenges. Next, please. And lastly, the environment, because there is obviously enormous public interest in and a growing recognition of how environmental issues impact on and are impacted by human health and well-being, but very little in the way of rigorous ethical deliberation. And that's something we're going to attend to over the next 5 years. Next slide, please. And there's more. We have commissioned work on disagreements between clinicians and parents by the Department of Health. Next. We probably are going to now institute shortly a major public engagement exercise in the form of a citizens' jury on the vexed issue of assisted dying. Next. We're doing collaborative work with the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is an institute also within the Nuffield Foundation that looks at issues in artificial intelligence and big data. And we're going to look at the relationship between AI and genomic research. Next. We've also got a commissioned welcome background document on climate change and health. Next. And we're just about to publish a major report on gerontological research, aging, and the issues that arise from an aging population. Next. And finally, we'll look at the lessons that might have been learned from COVID. Next slide, please. So I've identified here a number of emergent cross-cutting themes, and I'm going to go through each of this and hopefully make you aware of some of the thoughts we've had, not just over the last 5 years, but looking forward to the next 5 years. Next slide, please. So in terms of embedding ethics, I wanted to take the example of the NGB, which is the National Genomics Board. Next, please. And it is responsible in the UK for overseeing genomics strategy and its implementation across what is called the 4 nations in the United Kingdom. And I sit on that board as the chair of the Nuffield Council. Next. They have identified 3 pillars of their genomic strategy: diagnosis and personalized medicine, prevention, but also, interestingly, research and of relevance here. Next. And ethical regulation of all those areas is one of the cross-cutting themes. Next, please. And the vision stated there is all our genomic data systems will continue to apply consistent, high standards around data security, and the UK model will be recognized as being the gold standard for how to apply strong and consistent ethical and regulatory standards that support rapid healthcare innovation, adhere to legal frameworks, and maintain public and professional trust. Next, please. Part of my role on the NGB has been to try and insist that what we understand by ethical regulation of research is not restricted solely to data management, and nor is it simply about securing public trust. Next, please. And that we need to attend to a suite of other ethical issues that come up in implementing a genomic strategy. One of the most prominent, it seems to me, is the issue of equity or fairness in access to research and treatment. So we're working with those implementing in the government, implementing the genomic strategy, to ensure that there is this broader recognition of what ethics should be understood as. And in fact, the Nuffield Council is running a series of workshops with stakeholders in the sector of genomic research and clinical practice, trying to identify what they see as the pressing ethical issues, and we'll present the findings of those workshops to the government, hopefully towards the end of this year. We have 2 workshops in December, and thereby ensure that UK strategy has a proper and full understanding of ethical regulation in this particular area. Next slide, please. I thought, and this I assume will be very familiar to you, and I don't want to tell you how to suck eggs or to repeat what you're already familiar with, but at least to share with you the situation in the United Kingdom. Next, please. So research ethics committees, RECs, and there are over 80 currently in the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, are subject to the oversight of the HRA, the Health Research Authority, which can provide information, regulate, and ensure consistency across the sector. Next. But the situation is very different, and interestingly different, with clinical ethics committees, and I'm intrigued to know how it might work for you in Ireland. These are not similarly regulated. And the only thing that is comparable to the Health Research Authority is something called the United Kingdom Clinical Ethics Network, which is not an official body. It's actually essentially a self-regulating body in the sector, funded by the people who are members of it, and which meets regularly to discuss issues. There was a meeting of UK CEN just over a week ago, at which I spoke, and which seeks to provide information and support to ethics committees. And why this becomes important is because UK CEN have noted a growing number of CECs in the UK in the health sector, and this accelerated greatly during COVID, when, frankly, there was a lot of scrambling amongst health trusts and hospitals to get appropriate ethical advice in the very difficult emergency situation that was presented by COVID. Next, please. But what I wanted to say is something that is, I think, widely recognized, that there is not a clear, bright line between clinical and research ethics. Next, please. So to give you an example, I sit as a lay member of Great Ormond Street Hospital for Sick Children on its Clinical Ethics Committee. And we have to sometimes consider cases, particularly in what's often called last saloon cases, those of terminally ill infants and children, of whether it's appropriate to use experimental or unproven pediatric treatments. But if we do approve of that or recommend approval of that, we will of course insist that the treatment is properly evidenced, and any information on the outcomes from that treatment is widely disseminated and published. And therefore you have a strange and interesting mixture of clinical ethics. Is it right to offer this kind of unproven treatment? And research ethics, what can we learn from the provision of this treatment in, let's say, a few isolated cases? And one last case before I move on, I became aware during COVID, and again, I'm interested as to whether it was a similar case in Ireland, that many of those working at the front line, clinicians working at the front line of treating COVID patients, were actually experimenting with different kinds of treatment. I remember talking at length to a respiratory intensivist, and these were often in very desperate circumstances where not a lot was known about COVID and how to treat it. So clinicians and nurses were trying things to see what worked and then sharing the outcomes such as they were. And here's a nice example of clinical treatment providing a research function. Next, please. The next thing I think it's appropriate to mention to you is that in the UK at least, there's an extremely crowded field of bioethical institutions, individuals and agencies, what we have called at the Nuffield the bioethics landscape. Next, please. Indeed, I think the UK was notorious for something that became very evident during COVID. A landscape crowded with different bodies, clinical ethics committees, research ethics committees, professional bodies such as the British Medical Association and the Royal Colleges, official agencies such as the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, as well as academic organizations and individual bioethicists. And where a series of issues arose in COVID, they were giving various kinds of advice. So, for instance, on the question of how to prioritize treatment of COVID patients and how to identify those who should be first in the queue for what might be life-continuing treatment. Next, please. Now, obviously, the Nuffield Council played a particular role, but also there was a body that had been created prior to COVID called the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group that also was at certain points issuing guidance. And the issue becomes, how do we ensure that this kind of guidance is harmonized and is consistent across the sector? And many of those I spoke to in the sector, clinicians, for instance, were deeply confused about what they should take as the appropriate advice as to how to proceed. Next, please. There was, in other words, a plurality of advice being given, and it was not always entirely consistent across these different organizations. Next, please. Now, I think that situation in the UK, and again, I'm not clear how it might work in Ireland, is obviously quite distinct from how we know it works in European jurisdictions. So we have very close relations with the French Comité National d'Éthique and the Deutsche Ethikrat. And these are government-funded and government-appointed national ethics committees, which the Nuffield Council is not. We may be regarded as de facto the National Ethics Committee, but we do not have official status. And those two jurisdictions, the respective committees were offering advice from the top down to all those in the sector. And the Deutsche Ethikrat in particular issued a series of wonderful advisory documentations on various matters. So, for instance, What should be the priority rules about rolling out the vaccine? How should that be done fairly and equitably? And what were the relevant ethical considerations? That was not necessarily the case in the UK. Next, please. So there is an interesting question about what system is best. Do you let 100 flowers bloom? Do you devolve down to those local RECs and CECs because they may be best placed to make decisions in some area? Or do you do it from the top down by having a centralized system of national ethics advice? And how do we make the best use of the diverse resources that exist within something like the UK? Next, please. And the Nuffield Council is currently engaged in a mapping exercise, that is, trying to get a better sense of what is out there in the UK in terms of clinical ethics, research ethics, and bioethics more generally, and trying to play the role that we think appropriate, facilitating the best use of those resources and coordinating across the sector. And we're currently engaged in that and hope to do some more work over the next couple of years. Next slide, please. The next theme is interesting, and that is how one properly regulates research in the context of very rapid scientific progress. Next, please. Just a nice image for you of the future of reproduction. Next, please. And I sat for 12 years on the UK's Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, and I'm currently a member of what is called its Legislative Reform Advisory Group. Next, please. Because the HFEA, the authority, and the Act that set it up and created the regulatory mechanism is now over 30 years old and dates back to the wonderful committee work, committee chaired by the philosopher Mary Warner. But it's showing signs of its age, and there needs to be a question addressed of how we now bring it up to date, but do so in a way that preserves the best of that regulatory system, which I think is superb, but also knowing how governments work, ensuring that we don't demand too much change in the relevant act and the authority, particularly of a government who, as you will have noted, has a number of other priorities over the next few years. Next, please. And one thing that our group was made very quickly aware of was the extraordinary pace of relevant new research in this particular area. The possibility of creating what are called artificial gametes, with all the possibilities that raises for something approximating almost to cloning. Most recently, synthetic embryos. And lastly, perhaps on the distant horizon, ectogenesis, which this picture is attempting to represent, namely the possibility of gestation outside the human womb. And the group was saying, well, how do you create a legislative system that reflects these enormous changes and therefore protects what it was that Warnock originally hoped to do so by her recommendations? Next, please. So it does seem to me there's a very critical question here of how law and regulatory systems can anticipate and appropriately ethically regulate emerging science and research in this area. Next, please. And one particular case that presses very, very much at the moment is what is called the 14-day rule, which is the rule Warnock agreed on and set as the far side of embryos created for research. But what we now know, and why the question presses, is that much more can possibly be learned about embryonic development if we're allowed to do, if scientists are allowed to do research beyond the 14 days, and they are exerting pressure, not just nationally, this is happening internationally, for that rule to be relaxed. And yet there are considerably good reasons, it seems to me, to preserve the 14-day rule, but it's an interesting question of why. Next, please. Next, I want to just raise the issue of ethical preparedness. Next. Next. And this is a concept that we've made use of in the Nuffield, and has been prompted by the way in which different countries responded to ethical challenges with COVID. Next. And And it's acknowledging the importance of being ethically ready to respond to an emergency, which is in parallel to a kind of logistical readiness. And next, please. I wrote a blog which indicated that the priority here is to be ready as a society, not just to deal practically and efficiently with a pandemic, but to do so in a way that is ethically appropriate and fully justified. That is, to be in a position to offer authoritative, clear, and broadly acceptable ethical guidance. Next. So that brings me on to research on and in emergencies. Next, please. And here is a report next that was published by the Council in, in 2020, not 22, but was research on global health emergencies, the ethical issues, principally interested in questions around Ebola and SARS. Next. But made a number of recommendations that it seems to me were very relevant in the subsequent years of COVID. Better evidence is needed about what helps or doesn't help during an emergency in order to improve the response to what was recognized to be a global health emergency. Next. And also the report noted that research conducted during an emergency itself plays a crucial role in obtaining evidence and helps support any response. Next. Capacity building and inclusivity. I think there are two imperatives we've noted. Next. The first is ensuring that relevant research communities are empowered and that this is reflected both in research funding and research outcomes. Next. This was something that we made clear in the Global Health Emergencies report, in the way that the Global South was otherwise disempowered in research with and on it. Next. And second, proper involvement of those on or with whom research is done in the design and use of such research. Next. And here, our aging report, which is due out early next year, has stressed the importance of any research, gerontological research, paying proper attention to and involving the community of the aging. Next. And one of its recommendations is that ethics meetings should always try to meaningfully collaborate with older adults in any research seeking to influence our experience of aging. Next. I think this is my last slide, and this is just to say something about scientific knowledge. Next. The fully informed engagement of the public in research ethics requires both, next, knowledge and understanding of what I've indicated is a very rapidly developing and often incredibly complex science and technology. Next. And that's why, in our view, horizon scanning has to pay attention to public engagement. Next. But also, secondly, an understanding of what ethics is, how it's relevant, how it can be used to understand and evaluate those developments. Next. Whilst acknowledging that we do live in pluralistic societies and are governed by democratic values that protect the tolerance of very, very different and often irreconcilable values. Next. And the question here is, how do we link any ethical recommendations we might make to shared public values? Next. And I wanted to just end, if that's appropriate, on a personal note. Next. I live on the island of Ireland and I've worked here for a number of years, but I'm now very proud to have secured Irish citizenship. So I'm both a British and an Irish citizen. Next. And I very much welcome this research ethics initiative and I look forward to its further development. Next. And I think there's good reason to hope that that is across the whole island of Ireland. Next. And I'm more than happy personally to try to contribute in any way that is appropriate. Next, and finally, I thought my email address was going to be on that, but if you want my email, it's not there. It's on a later version, but you can find it on my Queen's University webpage. So thanks very much indeed.